Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our 19th lecture in the series of Philosophy of Science in Economics. If you recall, from lecture 16, 17, and 18, we started by handling one of the fundamental questions in the area of philosophy of science, and that is an issue of truth. And if you recall very well, initially, when I was giving you a definition of knowledge, I did say that knowledge has been defined in the past as justified true beliefs. And in that definition, we did look at a number of things. For instance, the issue of justification, the issue of beliefs, and the issue of truth. So truth is one of the fundamental questions in the area of philosophy of science that must be understood very well. Now, I know that I'll be taking you through this concept of truth probably for another 3 more lectures, meaning that this area or this topic may take us around 6 lectures. So far we have had 3 lectures, and in lecture 16, if you recall, I introduced the issue of knowledge, right? But more specifically in lecture 16, we're dealing with the truth, the central problem of philosophy, but centering on knowledge, truth, and justification. So in lecture 16, I gave you the introduction. I also took you through the 3 senses of nous, and nous here I mean K-N-O-W-S, the 3 senses of nous. And in those 3 senses of nous, if you recall, we looked at propositional knowledge. I also took you through what we call acquaintance knowledge. And then from there, we looked at the how-to knowledge. And then, of course, after that, we looked at the propositional knowledge and justified true beliefs. We handled the issue of beliefs, the issue of truth. And we also went through what we call epistemic justifications. Now, that took us to lecture 17, if you recall, and in lecture 17, we are concerned with truth lost. And that lecture centered mainly on that aspect of truth lost. Now, in lecture 18, I took you through the theories of truth. Unfortunately, the time that we had was too short, so we could not really go through everything. But I wanted actually at that material time to introduce you to the classical theories of truth. And of course, meaning that that lecture should have covered a preliminary map, correspondence theory, coherence theory, verification theory, pragmatism theory, and of course the identity theory. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, that was not possible. But however, I did give you an overall map that would certainly lead us into those particular theories, ladies and gentlemen. So truth is one of the central problems in the area of the theory of knowledge, and that is really philosophy of science. Now, just to remind you a little bit, in lecture 18, as we are concluding, I did give you a diagram, and that diagram was presented on the screen. And I don't have any problem showing you the same diagram on the screen. I'm sure you can now see that diagram on the screen here. And that diagram is actually a summary of the theories that we are going to discuss. And that's where I stopped, actually. In that diagram, if you recall, we talked about the truth of a truth bearer And the truth of a truth bearer is constituted by a number of things, ladies and gentlemen. Propositions, for instance, ideas, beliefs, sentences, and of course you have utterances and statements, as you can see on the diagram here. And you can see that information on the screen very well. So, but the truth of a truth bearer, which is constituted by those things that I've just given you, it takes two aspects here, as you can see on the diagram. Right, we have one and then we have two. So the truth of a truth bearer is, of course, a genuine property of the, I mean, if you look at it as a genuine property, you are looking at substantive theories. So you can say the truth of a truth bearer is a genuine property, and that's number one, as you can see on the screen here. And then that takes substantive theories. That's the route that we take. Now, but you can also say that the truth of a truth bearer is not a genuine property. And the moment you start looking at the truth of the truth bearer, which is not a genuine property, we take what we call the minimalist theories, ladies and gentlemen. Now, when we turn to number one, as you can see on the diagram, and we say that the truth of a truth bearer is a genuine property, but that takes on the dimension of an intrinsic property, then, of course, we are still in the substantive theories, as you can see, but it also takes on the second aspect of a relational property. So it's a genuine property, that is fine, but it can take on an intrinsic property, or what you call a relational property. Now, when we look at number two, where we have the relational property, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, we can still subdivide that. And we say, well, this relational property can be constituted by relations, because we are talking about relational property. And these relations can be to other truth bearers. So if we are looking at the relations substituted by, or so not substituted, but constituted by relations, as you can see on the diagram here, to other truth bearers, then we take on the coherence theory, but we can also take on B, as you can see on the diagram, where we look at to useful effects, and that is the pragmatism theory. Now, again, as we saw earlier on, that in relational property, you can take the element still for looking at being constituted by relations, but to other sorts of entities, because the first form was to other truth bearers, as you can see on the screen here, but it could also take on the form to other sorts of entities. And of course, there we'll look at the truth makers in form of facts, in form of statement of affairs, and so many other things, as you're aware of. So there we take on the correspondence theory, and of course, we can look at those aspects of other identities, ladies and gentlemen. So that's where we stopped last time when we were discussing the issue or the issues that led to the truth. And today, in our lecture 19, ladies and gentlemen, I intend to take you to another level. So lecture 18 was a preliminary kind of information, or what you call an overview, really, of classical theories of truth, which has been presented in the diagram that you've just seen here a few minutes ago. And now we go to our lecture 19, and we start looking at those theories one by one. And I want to start with the correspondence theory. I'm sure you've seen it on the screen. Then maybe in subsequent lecture 20, I might go to coherence and verification theory, and possibly lecture 21, we shall go to pragmatism element of truth and the identity theory of truth. So that's how we are moving, ladies and gentlemen, and allow me now to take you to the first aspect, But before I take you to the first aspect, I've given you a number of books, ladies and gentlemen, that you need to read. And those books, we cannot show those books on the screen here, but we are going to have that information appended to this lecture so that you can easily really go and pick that information. So we now start with the correspondence theory, ladies and gentlemen. I want you to note at this material time that the most common definition of truth, which is present in the philosophical tradition, is the most intuitive one. And of course, in this case, truth is considered as a relation of correspondence between the contents of our thoughts and reality. So remember, when we started dealing with the issues that led to the philosophy of science, one of the central issues that has been coming up from time to time is an issue of reality. Reality is out there, but can we attempt to pick that reality? First of all, can we describe what that reality is? And after describing that reality, is it possible for us to model that reality? Can we attempt to provide possible explanations to that reality? Remember, knowledge is justified through beliefs, right? And if we are looking at the element of reality out there, we cannot ignore the issue of beliefs coming in there, the issue of true, or what you call truth in this element. Remember, we are dealing with the true, the concept true, T-R-U-E, and that's what we are discussing in this lecture and the previous 3 lectures, and even the subsequent 2 other lectures will take us into this direction. The element of truth. Can we really go out and attempt to get a model that will capture that reality? And those are some of the issues we discussed again from lecture 13, if you recall, lecture 14 and lecture 15, where we looked at models and modeling in econometrics. In economics, how do we model, right? How do we come up with those particular models that capture reality out there without compromising and failing to pick the right information? So truth becomes a central issue, and that's why I'm saying that the most common definition that we find for the concept truth, right, certainly is the one that has been propounded by early philosophers, and it is the one that we call the most intuitive, where truth is a relation of correspondence between the contents of our thoughts, because we have thoughts that preoccupy us, and we use these thoughts to express what we see out there, the reality out there. So if we can get that kind of link between the thoughts in our minds and the reality, and there is correspondence between thoughts and reality, we can talk about the correspondence theory of truth, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, it doesn't end there. It goes to judgments as well and facts. As individuals, we make judgments from time to time, but there are also facts out there. So if there is a correspondence between our judgments and facts, then we can start talking about truth. So as you can see on this screen here, ladies and gentlemen, we can represent that in symbols, where we say that correspondence, right? So if you are dealing with the correspondence theory, X is true, ladies and gentlemen, if and only if X corresponds to the facts. And here the correspondence we are talking about actually is the contents of our thoughts, right, that are supposed to correspond to the reality out there. and of course between our judgments and facts which are there. So on the screen, that's a mathematical illustration or expression of what we are talking about. And the correspondence, ladies and gentlemen, if we start talking about our thinking and our perception, you discover that a correspondence conception of truth is often called a realist conception, in the sense that our thoughts are true in a virtue of something that is distinct from them. So you can talk about your thoughts, and you're saying, yes, your thoughts will be considered to be true in virtue of something that is distinct from them and independent from our thinking and knowing of them. Now, in this sense, the truth of a statement is also supposed to transcend our possible knowledge of it or its verification. And of course, as you can see here, we also have other perspectives of what truth is. So, and here we are talking about that correspondence between our judgments, the correspondence between our thoughts, and that correspondence of thoughts and our judgment must be linked to what we call facts and reality out there, ladies and gentlemen. But there are also other theories that seem to contradict this thinking. And of course, those are the ones that take the anti-realist perspective. So if we take now the other anti-realist perspective, then we may call the anti-realist any conception of truth according to which truth does not transcend our cognitive powers and is constrained by some epistemic conditions, ladies and gentlemen. So the use of the word realism in this case, this stage of our inquiry is vague when you bring in the element of anti-realism, for it will turn out that we shall be able to characterize a view as realist only when we are able to see whether, and if so, in what sense, it involves a distinctive conception of truth, ladies and gentlemen. So in this sense, any inquiry into the nature of truth will have to construct the various senses of realism at issue and must not take it as given. So moreover, as we shall see, correspondence is not the only possible realist conception of truth. There are so many other things that we may have to discuss, and we shall be discussing these ones. But for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, we can use the general characterization that I've just given you, where, of course, correspondence theories are supposed to spell this out in virtue of a relation, which is, to use the traditional scholastic phrase, a relation of adequacy of things to the intellect. And that is very important because it is often said that the first explicit formulation of this definition, of course, as we know very well, and as put forward by various scholars, actually appears in the famous passage that was given by Aristotle in that famous work or works that are referred to as metaphysics, and you know that very well. And Aristotle simply says in this case that to say of what is that it is not, and of what is not that it is false. I repeat that. To say of what is that it is not, and to also say of what is not that it is, that would be false. And of course, when you start talking about truth, the issue of false also come in, ladies and gentlemen. Now, while, again, if we follow the same kind of thinking, if you want to talk about truth, because where you have truth, you have false. And I've just told you to say of what is not, and of what is not, that it is. That is false. But the other aspect of truth, true, you might say, right? If you say that it is, while to say of what is, that it is, or what is not, that is not, that is true. And you find that in the works of Aristotle's metaphysics. To say what is, that it is, or of what is not, that it is not, right, is true. Now, of course, as you can see, whereas we pick this from the famous works of Aristotle, right, in his works of metaphysics, that kind of thinking is also far from clear. And to take up our distinction of the previous discussions which we have had, it is not obvious that Aristotle is here giving a definition of truth rather than a characterization of the meaning of true. And in some works, some other works, Aristotle explicitly talks of giving the meaning of true with such equivalences. And that's the works of Aristotle. And in other writings or other passages, he's quite explicit about the idea of a relation between the thing, what he calls the thing, or rather the fact, and the truth of the proposition, what he calls the logos. But he calls this relation a cause in this case. And the facts cause the truth of the proposition. And that is still found in the works of Aristotle's metaphysics. And if, in this case, it is a definition of truth, in terms of a certain relation, Aristotle, ladies and gentlemen, seems to say that truth is a relation of identity between what we say or think and reality out there. And that's where we started. That kind of correspondence between our thoughts, right? That kind of correspondence between the thoughts and reality, or thoughts and facts, right, is what is referred to as the truth in this case. And that's what it is. Now, if to say, ladies and gentlemen, what is true, and to say what is to say the same thing, then truth and being are one and the same thing. If we follow the conception and the understanding advanced by Aristotle in his works in metaphysics, and we articulate the same issues, right? And we say what is true, and that is to say what is, all right, or what is false and what is not. And if we equate that to say the same thing, then in this case, truth and being are one and the same thing. So in this case, from the works of Aristotle, right, the element of truth and being are put together and lumped up together. We are going to question that as well in the next few minutes. So as you can see, there's a difficulty here, ladies and gentlemen, and that's why Aquinas, commenting upon this same kind of thought and the passage, and he said, Aquinas, you know, is also one of the philosophers, early philosophers we have. Aquinas did certainly interrogate this kind of thought, and he said, if truth and being are the same thing, it would be vain to talk about a true being, right? Because quite often we talk about a true being, which is not the case. Hence, in this case, you cannot equate, right, what we call true and being. So Aquinas says this is not the case because you cannot equate truth and being, and therefore, when you start talking about a true being, then certainly you are contradicting the thinking or the thoughts advanced by Aristotle. So in this case, Aquinas says, though, this is not the case, and therefore the two are not in any way identical, ladies and gentlemen. Now, those are the ideas of Aquinas. Now, in this case, truth, therefore, adds something to being. And again, as you can see, this is from the works of Aquinas, right? So truth adds something to being. And this something is a relationship of correspondence, or what you may call adequacy between the thing and the intellect. If you're talking about the reality or the facts and your thoughts, right? And of course, reality and all sorts of ideas that you may have in your mind, ladies and gentlemen. So this definition that I've just given you a few seconds ago is the one that has been adopted by the tradition. And it's also found in the works of Descartes, one of the early philosophers, in the works of Leibniz, and for some of you who have done mathematics, you understand Leibniz very well, the Leibnizian theory, especially in mathematics, and in the works of Hume and Kant. You recall Immanuel Kant, and all these works certainly do bring out this concept. So most of the time, ladies and gentlemen, it seems to be taken up from the scholastic tradition. The definitions we are talking about, right, are taken up from the scholastic tradition, that without any reattempt to explain what it means or to spell out the appropriate relation. So when you bring out the concept of truth, many people will find difficulties to articulate what truth is. And if one jumps from the 14th century to the discussions that have shaped the contemporary versions of this view of truth, it is interesting to note that Frege, one of the main founders of analytic philosophy, stumbles about the very difficulty that Aquinas noticed, and takes it as a fundamental obstacle to the definition of truth as a correspondence. And in fact, in this case, when you start talking about correspondence, you're saying a correspondence can only be perfect if the corresponding things coincide and are therefore not distinct things at all. So in other words, if you're talking about your thoughts must correspond to the facts out there. Right, and that is what it is. So the reality out there and your thoughts, right, and the perspectives you have in your mind should be exactly the same. So there should be a correspondence, right? This corresponds to that. Now, certainly as you can see here, it is said to be possible to establish the authenticity, for instance, of a banknote, if we use the banknote as an example here, by comparing it stereotypically or stereoscopically with an authentic one. So in other words, if you pick two banknotes, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm sure you know what we are talking about. I can give you an example. If you pick this banknote right here, right, and you want to really find out whether it is the true banknote in this sense or in this perspective, ladies and gentlemen, then you must do something about this. So what you have to do, right, you have to have a true banknote somewhere. So in other words, if you have two banknotes, and this is the true banknote, right, and this is the one that you want to really see whether it is the true banknote. So in this kind of perspective, right, you must be able to establish the authenticity of a banknote by comparing it stereoscopically with an authentic one, right? And that's the kind of argument that is being advanced here in terms of correspondence. This corresponds to this. But it would be ridiculous to try to compare a gold piece with a 20-mark piece stereoscopically, ladies and gentlemen. So it would only be possible to compare an idea, in this case, an idea, with a thing, if the thing were an idea too. So just like you have a true banknote, right, and you have another one that you have to authenticate, and one must correspond to the other. Now, when you start talking about an idea that must correspond to a fact, right, you see, you have an idea, and an idea resides in your mind, but a fact is somewhere there. So what we are saying here is very simple, right? So it would only be possible and wise in this sense to compare an idea with a thing if the thing were an idea too. So in other words, you must compare, right, an idea to an idea, just like we have tried to compare or correspond this banknote to another banknote, just like if you are going to again do the same thing, right, compare a book. Now if you begin using this, you are looking for truth, right, then you have this, and then you have a book here, and then you want to get correspondence between the two. It is impossible. At the end of the day, you'll find some kind of difficulties. So these are the kind of arguments that we are trying to interrogate that have been put forward by the various scholars and philosophers of science for a very long time. So it is only possible to compare an idea with a thing if the thing were an idea too. And then if the first did not correspond perfectly with the second, then they would coincide in this case. But this is not at all what is wanted in this case. When a truth is defined as a correspondence of an idea with something real, it is absolutely essential that the reality be distinct from the idea. So that reality should be distinct from the idea, ladies and gentlemen. But then there can be no complete correspondence, meaning that you can't have what we call complete truth. So if there can be no complete correspondence, and you're talking about correspondence, because in this case here, you can talk about that correspondence because you are comparing a banknote and a banknote. But if you are comparing an idea, right, my idea, to a thing that is real out there, ladies and gentlemen, we are simply saying that there can be no complete correspondence and therefore no complete truth, ladies and gentlemen. So nothing at all would be true, for what is only half true is untrue, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why Frege here raises a dilemma for the correspondence theorists. And according to Frege, either truth is a relation of identity between a representation and something real. But this is absurd, for it makes no sense to say that the representation and the thing are one and the same, because you've got a thought, right, or a representation and the real thing out there. Now, whereas talk of correspondence implies that they are different, or of course, you know, they are different, but then there can never be any full correspondence, ladies and gentlemen, in the sense of coincidence between the correspondence and thing. Now, in this case, we would have to say that the two coincide more or less, or only to a certain degree, but you can't achieve that total correspondence. Remember, we are interrogating the correspondence theory, right? And that's where the weaknesses of the correspondence theory are. But this is equally absurd, ladies and gentlemen, for truth does not admit of degrees. So if, for instance, you are comparing now, right, because you have full correspondence, and you can only say, well, there is some bit of coincidence, right? So and the coincidence is between the representation, right, or my thoughts and the real thing out there. Right, and that's the second aspect we have, ladies and gentlemen. And you can only say the two coincide more or less or only to a certain degree, you will find that this is absurd, ladies and gentlemen, for truth does not admit of degrees. Either a thought is true, ladies and gentlemen, or it isn't. And there are no intermediates in that kind of situation. You can't have an intermediate truth, right? Now, Frege interrogates this concept further, and he has another argument that he raises, which is not only different or directed at the definition of truth as correspondence, but as any sort of definition. And Frege here says, yes, although we are dealing with the definition of truth, right, the understanding of truth, and the truth is a central issue in the philosophy of science, right, but the kind of thinking that comes up here must be true for any definition, not only for truth, right? So Frege raises that other argument, which is not only directed at the definition of truth as correspondence, but at any sort of definition. And of course, Frege simply says it can't be laid down that truth exists when there is a correspondence in a certain respect. Right, so he questions, but he says we need to understand what is constituted by that particular thing. For what would we then have to do to decide whether something is true? And we should have to put up a number of questions and inquire whether it is true that an idea and a reality perhaps corresponded in the laid down respect. So there are those certain things that we need to lay down and then say, yes, in the laid down respects, maybe these correspond. So you can actually say the idea, right, corresponds to the reality out there. And we should be confronted by a question of the same kind, and the game could begin again, ladies and gentlemen. So the attempt to explain truth as correspondence collapses in this case. And every other attempt to define truth collapses too. For in a definition, certain characteristics would have to be stated. And in application to any particular case, the question would always arise whether it were true that the characteristics were present. So one goes around, round and round and round in circles, and consequently it is possible that the content of the word true that we are interrogating here is unique and indefinable, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, the second argument can be cast also in the following way. And let's just try imagine going back to the propositions. I hope you still remember propositional knowledge and so forth. And that was our lecture 15, if you recall very well. Lecture 16. Right, where we introduced the concept of truth in this way. So let us suppose, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see on the screen here, I'm going to show you this equation. It's very important, but let us suppose that truth consists in a correspondence between some thought or judgment that we shall call P. So remember, we are dealing with truth, right? And we are dealing with the correspondence theory. So in other words, your idea and your thoughts must correspond to reality and should correspond to facts out there. But let us in this case suppose that truth, as you can see on the screen here, is a correspondence between some thought or judgment that we shall call P. So to some, and this correspondence here, right, between that judgment and thought, right, is linked to what we call some item in the world or a fact, right? So a thought or an idea corresponds to reality out there or to facts out there. So in this case, we are saying, we are assuming that this truth, right, which is presented in the correspondence theory, is between some thought or a judgment that we shall call P. So a thought or a judgment is P, as you can see here, right, corresponding to some item in the world we shall call F, ladies and gentlemen. So we shall define the truth, as you can see on the screen here, define the truth of P, which is now an idea or a thought, as the obtaining of this relation that we shall call C, the relation C. So meaning that C, as you can see on the screen here, C1, the thought that P is true if and only P corresponds to F, right? Just to remind you, P was a thought and P is the idea which corresponds to facts out there in the world or the reality out there. So mathematically, we can say C, right, as you can see here, right? And I hope you see that nicely on the screen. That C1, the thought that P, an idea or thought, is true. And is only true if and only if that thought or idea corresponds to the facts out there in the world. So that's what you see on the screen. Now, the thought P corresponds to the facts should itself be true if the definition that I've given you, C1, is to be correct, ladies and gentlemen. So that's the correspondence theorem. And according to our definition, this should be cast in terms of a correspondence between C1 and a fact, which will presumably be a different fact from, say, F, and that is, say, F star. So if this situation that I've just given you, right, where we say in C1 that P, which is a thought or an idea, corresponds to the facts in the world or reality out there, and is true if and only if, right, P corresponds to the facts. Now, we can extend the same argument, right, that once this situation of C1 obtains, then, right, it would presumably be a little bit different from the fact that F, right, will be equal to probably F dash in this case, or F star. So in this case, we can say that C2, right, which we are taking now as the second equation, you can still see that on the screen. The thought that P, which is a thought or an idea, corresponds to facts F, right, or reality out there, is true if and only if P corresponds to F, which is a fact, and it corresponds to F star in this case. So, but for C2 to be true, ladies and gentlemen, it has to correspond to a further fact, and that is F star star star. And it is clear that here we embark on a regress, which can be called Frigg's regress. So Frege, as he continued to present his arguments, trying to dismiss the ideas that Aristotle certainly came up with, where you start now relating or corresponding thoughts and ideas to facts, things which are not the same. Now this brings in the Frigg's regress argument. And therefore, in this case, Frege argues, right? And his argument is very simple. The argument can be generalized to any sort of relation which can be put in the place of correspondence in this case. And that's what we've seen. P corresponds to F, corresponds to F star, corresponds to F star star. And therefore, in this case, it will go through two if we took truth to be an intrinsic property. And there's this kind of thinking that truth is there, but truth can be an intrinsic property. And those are some of the ideas we presented and discussed in our earlier lectures, if you recall. Hence, Frege, in this case, concludes, right, the content of the word true is indefinable, and if this word is to denote a relational property, these are equally indefinable. Actually, Frege takes truth to be property of thought, but he considers that it is impossible to define it. And this threatens a theory of truth as correspondence, but also any theory that would aim at giving a definition of truth will still be threatened by the same kind of thoughts that Frege puts forward. So the regress argument, which we call the Frege's regress argument, can in fact be formulated in an even more general way as a version of the paradox of analysis. Now, to analyze, if we attempt to come up with that kind of analysis, ladies and gentlemen, we also try to understand what Frege was trying to advance in form of an argument or arguments dismissing the earlier thoughts or the correspondence theory, right, which Aristotle and other scholars have attempted to put forward. So as you can see here, the regress argument certainly can be reformulated, as I've already told you, in an even more general way, as a version of the paradox of analysis. And an analysis or a definition of truth is virtuous. And when we say it's virtuous, we say it's hollow, it's empty, it's void, right? A definition of truth from the works of Frege in this case. So once we go to the paradox of analysis, an analysis or a definition of truth is virtuous, right? And of course, here we are saying it is hollow, it is empty, if it is informative and purports to be a genuine definition, ladies and gentlemen. So in the first case, as we saw, it is not a genuine definition, but an innocuous paraphrase. Now, in the second case, as I've already presented on the screen here, it can't be a genuine definition either, because it will use the notion of truth in the definition, and you can't define truth again using the same truth in the same definition, ladies and gentlemen. So this is illustrated by the definition of truth as correspondence with the facts, right? Either to say that P, in this case the idea or thought, is true, corresponds to the facts, is just another empty way of saying that P is true, or it really informs us about the content of truth. Because when you start talking about facts, right, and you're talking about truth, this other side, and if you're talking about thoughts and ideas, which are certainly true, if they correspond to facts and they are the same and one thing at the end of the day, so you're actually saying truth is equal to truth, right, or truth corresponds to truth. So as you can see, it then has to be a fact that an idea or a thought corresponds to the facts, or that P, which again is an idea or thought, corresponds to the fact, is a fact. So if it corresponds to the facts, is a fact, right? Again, you are using fact and facts to define truth in that perspective. And when you look at the facts again, which constitute something, again, you're saying truth corresponds to truth. So unless we have an understanding of the notion of fact, independent of our understanding of the notion of truth, such a definition tells us nothing, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if an elucidation of truth in terms of correspondence with the facts is not to be idle, one must deploy a notion of fact and also deploy a notion of correspondence that would allow us to go further than the trivial equivalence between it is true that P, that's an idea or thought, and it is a fact that an idea or thought corresponds to the facts out there. It must provide a genuine account of facts as special kinds of entities that can be candidates for the relationship of truth-making in this perspective. And although the notion of facts as a primitive entity in this case has been invoked by other philosophers such as Aristotle, Leibniz, I already given you Leibniz, Brentano and his disciples, Husserl, I hope you remember Husserl and Reinecker, it has only gained philosophical prominence within the early analytic philosophy through Russell and the Wittgenstein's tractors when they developed the doctrines associated with the logical atomism. And I hope you still remember this. Now, of course, in this case here, in his Problems of Philosophy, Russell attempted to explain the truth of a judgment, such as Othello believes that Joshua loves Janet. We are using now the case of Othello. And this is exactly what Russell attempted to bring forward in his Problems of Philosophy, right, to try and explain the truth of a judgment. So if we take this example, Othello believes that Joshua loves Janet as a relation of correspondence between the propositional complex, right, that Joshua loves Janet, and a complex entity in the world made up of the individuals called Joshua and Janet. Remember, the thought or an idea must correspond to reality out there, right? The idea or the thought must correspond to the facts, right, out there. We are talking about facts. So in other words, if you are talking about Othello, right, who believes, remember that's his belief, right, or her belief, if that's a lady. Othello believes that Joshua loves Janet. That is the kind of belief in the mind. Now, if you take that as a relation of correspondence, right, it will be a relation of correspondence between the propositional complex, because in this case, you've got a number of people in this relationship, right, as you can see. And the first one is that Joshua loves Janet. So that love between the two, right, is the first element that we see. And of course, the other one is a complex entity in the world, right, where you have, which is made up of individuals, of course, Joshua and Janet. And that world is very complex for us to try and study and understand. And you are simply saying that, you know, use correspondence, right? But the love between Joshua and Janet is complex, as you can see. So there must be a world of love that constitutes these two. First of all, the two must be there, and these two must exist in a world somewhere. And there's also a complex of relationships taking place between these two people, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, the other aspect is the love, complex of love that seems to be taking place between these two people. So, and this is something that we might express, if you wanted to express this mathematically, right, with symbols, where you have Joshua, Janet, and of course the word love or loves, right, because we are saying Joshua loves Janet. So that relationship involves Joshua as an individual, Janet, and then the concept loves. Now, where the items in this list are taken to be real things in the real world, and that we can even understand these things, ladies and gentlemen. So we can formulate this conception, ladies and gentlemen, and you can see that on the screen. And this will be the correspondence theory of facts on the screen here, where, of course, we try to say the proposition that P is true, right? And it's only true if and only if the fact, right, that corresponds to P obtains. Remember, you're talking about love, right? So if you're talking about a thought or an idea, and in this case it is in the form of love, right? Remember, there's that complex world between these three people, Joshua, Janet, and love, as I've already told you. But you can take another example, right, where, of course, you are dealing with the correspondence theory of facts, and you say the proposition that P is true right, if and only if the fact P, right, obtains. And that's very important. That's why we put P with these equal or less signs, as you can see, equal or less. So the two must correspond in that perspective. So where that less or equal to P stands for some complex entity made up of individuals, you can see that on the screen, made up of individuals, made up of properties or relations, and obtains. So the issue is that this must be there, it must obtain. And obtains here is the holding of the appropriate correspondence relation between these. Now, in some of his writings, Russell continues to say that as far as if you have that entity P, right? So, by the way, Russell attempts to bring this into reality and to make people understand what he was trying to put forward. So, in some of his writings, Russell goes as far as to say that this entity, the fact that P, you have that less or equal to P, is the very content of the judgment. That is, the latter is constituted by the actual fact. So in other words, that proposition must correspond to the facts out there in the world, or that reality, and that's a complex world and a complex reality. So here, Russell seems to hold the view that truth is not the correspondence of a thought with a fact, but the identity between the two. So he brings in the element of identity, modifying our original thinking that we took from Aristotle and other scholars, that an idea or a thought must correspond to facts out there or the reality, and that will be truth. Now, Russell says that is not correct, because these three entities must exist, and that the kind of world or the reality where these three things exist, where you have Joshua and you have Janet and you have love or loves, right, existing and pertaining or obtaining, must be a complex world. And understanding that is not very easy. And you can't easily draw a line and you say that A corresponds to B. Right, so where the idea and the thought corresponds to facts out there. So Russell brings in this element of identity. So Russell seems to hold the view that truth is not the correspondent of a thought and a fact. So you'll never make a thought correspond to a fact. It is not possible. And that's why in the example that we gave, right, where we were talking about the true banknotes, right, we had, right, that you will have this other one, right, that you want to, of course, verify. You want to find out whether it is true, but you must have a true banknote somewhere, so that you look at these two and see whether this one corresponds to this, right? So it's a banknote and a banknote, right? So the correspondence between the same items. But when you start corresponding thoughts, right, ideas with the facts out there, a fact is not the same as an idea. A fact is not the same as a thought out there. So that's why Russell, who is also a philosopher, comes up and dismisses the earlier thinking that truth is not the correspondent of a thought with a fact, but the identity between the two. So he now introduces the element of identification. So identity. So I'm showing this on the screen here. I'm sure you can see. So let us call this the identity theory of facts, ladies and gentlemen. So as you can see, the identity theory of facts, right, is the proposition that P is true. And when we talk about P, those are thoughts and ideas. P is true if and only if P, right, and that P which has less or equal to, right, in the middle, as you can see, are identical. So you can talk about identity in this perspective, and then we do with the word correspondence, ladies and gentlemen. But as you can see here, there are two evident difficulties with each view. And as you can see, first, either it does not tell us anything about the content of the belief, or it makes it something different when the belief is false and when the belief is true, ladies and gentlemen. So it seems hard, as you can see here, to say that the real individuals in their relations are the constituents of the judgments, right? So where you have real individuals, right, in this kind of relations that we are talking about, right, and saying they are the constituents of the judgments, that becomes a little bit problematic, as you can see. It would seem more reasonable to say that it is the individuals and the relations as they are thought of, that is, as mental entities that are the objects of the judgment. And the reason here is obvious. The judgment may be false, while the subject may be related to the thought and its constituents nevertheless. And even if we take the constituents as real, ladies and gentlemen, we have no means to discern from the judgment itself as constituted from the triple relation that I gave you between Joshua, Janet, and loves, which is a concept. So that's what it is, that the elements are ordered in the appropriate way. The individuals may judge that Janet loves Joshua and thus be in contact with the three elements, but probably in the wrong way. So it's possible to be in contact with these three, Janet, Joshua, and you see an element of love, right? You can observe it using observation, but you've been in contact with these three elements, Janet and Joshua, in the wrong way. Therefore, your interpretation of truth and your justification of truth will certainly be wrong, ladies and gentlemen. So even the identity concept has flaws in this perspective. And of course, the other aspect, the second aspect, ladies and gentlemen, this difficulty that we are trying to articulate here also affects the view that the relation is not of identity, but of correspondence in this case. So we go back to the issue of correspondence. Now, the view seems to be correct when the judgment is actually connected to the complex entity, but when it is false, there is no such a relation in that perspective, ladies and gentlemen. So these are the kind of debates that can be found in literature. And in order to maintain his theory, the truth, and you know that theory, the theory of truth, correspondence theory of truth and identity theory of truth in this perspective, in order to maintain his theory that truth involves a relation with a fact, Russell has to say that false judgments also involve such a relation, but with negative facts or objective falsehoods. And this sounds incredible, ladies and gentlemen. It brings another perspective that comes from Wittgenstein's version of logical atomism, which attempts to avoid these difficulties. So I'll ask you during your free time to go and look for Wittgenstein's version of logical atomism so that we try to understand what Wittgenstein attempts to bring forward in order to contradict again, not even contradict, but improve the works of Russell and the works of Aristotle, ladies and gentlemen. So, but that's what it is. So, of course, if you go back to Wittgenstein's version of logical atomism, here he holds a correspondence theory of truth where propositions represent, right, or picture reality, and where the elements of propositions, which you have already seen, which I've already given you, are ultimately names, and they correspond to the elements of reality. And this is what we do when we are actually trying to model. If you have followed my lectures from lecture 13, 14, and 15, lectures on models and modeling in economics, you may have seen this. You have a reality out there, right? You attempt to understand, but you come up with the concepts which will represent events in the world out there. So, as you can see, Wigston's thinking avoids the difficulties of Russell's theory of judgment, first by distinguishing facts from states of affairs. And in this case, the states of affairs are the merely possible correspondence of propositions, which, when they are true, correspond to facts in this case. And hence, the facts are only the truth makers of true propositions. And of course, secondly, here, there are no negative facts in particular, because in the proposition where you can say not P, right, where you have your ideas, your thoughts and so forth, not P, right? In the proposition not P, the logical constant not, right, does not represent anything in this case. So reality is only made up of elementally, right, or atomic positive facts, ladies and gentlemen. So, and the third element that we see here is the correspondence relation between propositions and facts is characterized as structural isomorphism between propositions and the states of affairs. But when the relation between proposition and the state of affairs obtains, it is realized that is when the propositions is true and denotes a fact, it is something that can only be shown and can't be said. So in the end, the correspondence relations is itself ineffective, ladies and gentlemen, and this avoids the Frigg's regress problem that we saw, for we do not have to say that when P is true. No, it is a fact that P corresponds to a fact, but it only avoids it at the price of making the relations unexplainable. And of course, we have got so many arguments from scholars, ladies and gentlemen. So another argument has been advanced by Putnam in 1983, and it involves a complex theorem of a model theory, as you can see. But we can formulate it in the following way. If we grant that there is a world that is independent of our thoughts in the way a correspondence theory requires, then there have to be a large number of relations that hold between our thoughts and that particular world or assertions, ladies and gentlemen. So it's very important for us to understand what Putnam is trying to advance. And Putnam shows that if the world contains infinitely many elements, and that's what happens, reality out there has so many, infinitely infinitely many elements, there must be many alternative ways of mapping the world onto the thoughts or assertions. So you can map the two because the world is complex, as you can see. And if you recall our first lectures, and that must have been lecture 1 and lecture 2, where we talked about reality out there is complex. Reality out there is dynamic. Reality, there are so many things that, you see, you might see reality right now at a point or at a time t. Let me tell you, because of the various interactions, right, various things are taking place there. When you come back at a certain time, T1 or T2, you'll find different kind of reality out there. And this is what Putnam is trying to advance in his argument, that there must be many alternatives of mapping the world onto our thoughts or assertions, because you've got a very complex world, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why he brings out the complex theorem of model theory, where he grants that there is a world that is independent of our thoughts in the way of a correspondence theory requires, right? And then at that material moment, there have to be a large number of relations that should be between it and our thoughts and assertions. And that even explains the kind of lenses that we bring to the fore when we're explaining these things. And that's why Putnam shows that if the world contains infinitely many elements, right, as I've said earlier on, I'm just emphasizing this point, there must be many alternative ways of mapping the world onto our thoughts and assertions, which are just as systematic as the relation of correspondence is said to be. But how can we pick out these relationships, ladies and gentlemen, and how can we decide that is the one that we intend to talk about when we talk about correspondence? And this is the same question that we are confronted with when we go out to do research, right? You pick a particular problem, a particular issue, and you want to advance knowledge, you want to explain that particular aspect. But remember, if you are about 10 people, right, and with different backgrounds, you have a lawyer, for instance, and if you recall the example I gave you, that if somebody is knocked down here at the gate of the university by an over-speeding vehicle, right, and the student is knocked down there, or probably a lady that was crossing the road is probably knocked down. And then you have so many people coming on the scene. You have a city planner on the scene. Then you have a traffic officer at the scene here. And then you've got a policeman, right? Another general policeman. And then you've got a lawyer. And then you've got an academic. You've got a psychologist, right? etc. And all these fellows are there. I can assure you, their construction of reality will be totally different. A policeman will start by saying that, you know, the fellow was driving a car that can be classified as BMC. The fellow will say, well, it's a bad mechanical conditioned vehicle. So the road was, sorry, the vehicle was not supposed to be on the road. And that's what he will say. He might even say that the fellow who was driving was actually drunk, or the fellow who was driving did not have a valid permit. Or he might even say that, you know, the vehicle did not have an insurance cover, or probably a valid license, that kind of thing. So that is his conception, and this is his thinking, and therefore the cause of the accident is that. Now, a psychiatrist will probably give a different version of it. He will look at the problem from the victim's perspective, and he will say that this lady who was crossing the road has had problems with the terrible, she has had problems with the previous boyfriends. And you know, she had the first one, but they broke up under unclear circumstances, and had the second one, but you know, she was disappointed, and she was deeply taken up in thoughts, etc. But the problem was not actually the fellow who was driving the vehicle, it was actually the lady, right? Now, if you bring now the city engineer or the city planner, I will say, this place is badly designed, right? You don't have this or the other. There could have been a warning sign the other side, and he may actually shift the blame from the student or the lady who was crossing, or even from what the policeman was trying to articulate, and say, no, the problem is actually the lady. The lady was in a certain condition that was not probably stable. And the fellow might even say that the car was not overspeeding. That was the normal speed, but the problem was totally different. So I think you can see here, when we take the arguments of Putnam, that we have a complex world with the complex elements, right? And if that is so, there must be many alternative ways of mapping the world onto our thoughts and assertions, which are just as systematic as the relation of correspondence is said to be. But of course, you have those other things. How can we say that this is what we are going to pick, this is what we are going to examine? And Putnam takes this to refute the absolute conception of reality, or the external or transcendent realist conception of truth, ladies and gentlemen. So his argument has strong affinities with another well-known argument in contemporary philosophy, and that is the Queen's thesis of the inscrutability of reference. I don't know whether you even remember the lecture that we went through, construction of the world. I hope you still remember that was our lecture number 3, if I'm not mistaken, lecture number 3, where we looked at Laplace's scrutability theorem. Now, of course, you can see the argument of Putnam being related to the argument of Queen's, right? And in this case, the argument of Putnam is certainly related to the Queen's thesis of the inscrutability of reference, ladies and gentlemen. And in this case, given one way of mapping words onto things, there are in principle many other non-equivalent ways of doing this, all compatible with the data, ladies and gentlemen. So these arguments, as we can see, they are controversial, certainly, very controversial, but it's clear that they make life easy for a correspondence theory. Now, two strategies are still open to the partisans of a correspondence theory of facts, ladies and gentlemen. They can either try to provide the more stringent conditions of individuation of facts, or simply accept that the notion of fact is bound to remain vague. And a number of versions of the first strategy exist, and of course the number of things that we see in this case. So they all have to resist in some way, right, that some other arguments like the slingshot arguments, and of course come up with the more fine-grained notion of facts, and avoiding the classical difficulties that we have already examined. And another related tradition consists in elaborating the Leibnizian's Husserlian notion of truth maker. And the first step in order to avoid the problem of making facts, the tautological accusatives of truth. Because you can have a tautological relationship in this case, right? I hope you remember, for some of you have done philosophy, and you have studied logic, right? Where you have the truth, false, you can have a tautology of relationships. So again, I want to invite you to go and read what we call truth tables, which emerge from that relationship. That it comes from logic, right? Logic. So you need to go and study logic. Now, of course, that is the kind of perspective or concept or idea that we are actually discussing. And that's a related tradition which relates to the Leibnizian Husserlian notion of the truth maker. And of course, that's where the first step attempts to avoid the problem of making facts the tautological accusatives of truth. Of course, in this case, which consists in allowing other entities than facts and distinct from them to be truth makers. And of course, that's what we saw in the instance of the Wittgenstein's perspective. Now, another person who joins the discussion at this level that you need to know is Ramsey. Ramsey, in his criticism of Russell, he takes this step, right, that I've just talked about, the tautological perspective. He says that what makes it true that Caesar died, for instance, is not the fact that Caesar died. No. Right? I hope you are following. Ramsey, we are now getting into Ramsey's argument. And Ramsey is critiquing Russell and attempting to dismiss what Russell has put across. And if you recall, Russell, right, has also tried to dismiss the works of other previous scholars in this case. So, Ramsey, in his criticism of Russell, takes this direction. And he says that what makes it true that Caesar, for instance, died, or Mugabe died, It is not the fact that Mugabe or Caesar died. No. But the event of his death, which is an insight rediscovered by Davidson in his analysis of action sentences. And if you look at the works of Ramsey 1930, and you look at the other works of Marrigan et al. 1984, and Davidson 1967, etc., you'll find these arguments there. So, and in this case, that's why he goes ahead and says, well, if you take an example of Caesar, what makes the fact that Caesar died is not the fact that Caesar died. What makes it true that Caesar died is not the fact that Caesar died, because we know Caesar died. It's a fact. So if you are letting correspondence, right, and even identity and other modification you are bringing in, again you are relating thoughts, ideas with the reality out there. Caesar died is a reality, right? And it's also true that Caesar died. If we go through the events, that's according to Russell, what makes it true that Caesar died is not the fact that Caesar died, but the event of his death. The event of his death. And that is an insight that tells us exactly what took place. And that's where the issue of truth comes in. An individual event, right, is a particular, not a fact. We are not dealing with facts here. An individual event is a particular aspect, right? We are dealing with events, but not a fact in this case. So to see the difference, one can reflect that one does not say that Caesar's death is true, and that one can say that his death had a cause, whereas the fact that he died has no cause. So look, go through the events, right? The events that led to his death. Now, if you look at the events, then at the end of the day, you can come up and tell us that it is a fact that actually Caesar died. So the trouble, again, with this proposal is that it is not clear that one can specify the event without describing it as a fact, such as the event of Caesar dying. It's an event, fine. But is it possible for you to describe it without really saying it is a fact? Or the event that Caesar died, and that not all sentences refer to events in this case. And of course, for instance, an identity such as A equals A is not made true by an event or a state of affairs, but by an object. And of course, as you can see here, one has to expand the ontology of truth makers. The ontology of truth makers has to be expanded to include objects, states, processes, abstract particulars, or tropes, and so on and so forth. So, whereas we are talking about these aspects, right, and we are talking about the truth makers, we have to expand the ontology of truth makers to include all objects, states, processes, etc., rather than just attempting to describe the possible ontologies necessary for such views, right? And of course, this is very important. Simply describing the events is not very sufficient, but you may have to expand the ontologies of the truth makers to include all of those objects and so many other things. Of course, this takes us to another perspective that has been presented by Armstrong, right? But in the interest of time, I don't really want to spend too much time talking about the correspondence theory. Maybe sooner or later, I should be coming to a close, right? So as you can see, let me just give you just a brief kind of thinking from the perspective of Armstrong. On Armstrong's version of the correspondence theory of facts, the truth-making relationship is not one, but one, many, or many on one. So when you go into the mapping, right, so you can have one being mapped onto many, but you can also have many being mapped onto one. And that's the argument presented by Armstrong. So if we take an example, in this case, if P or Q, right, inclusive, is true, then this truth has two truth makers. That is P and that is Q. Or, in this case, if we take for a true existential sentence, and we say that there is at least one black swan, right? So in this case, there are as many truth makers as there are black swans, right? And conversely, one truth maker corresponds to many truths, as you can see. So one truth maker corresponding to many truths, right? But the converse is also true, ladies and gentlemen, right? So conversely, one truth maker corresponds to many truths. For instance, if it is true that either P or Q is true, then the truth maker for P is also a truth maker for the disjunctive truth and for innumerably many other truths, ladies and gentlemen. And that's the argument of Armstrong. Now, although this avoids the second horn of the slingshot dilemma above, which I've already given you, ladies and gentlemen, in our earlier discussions, it is hardly, this kind of thinking hardly, especially Armstrong's version, hardly avoids the first thinking that we had. Right, and for the last example, really we see that there can be one truth maker for many truths. And in the end, the world itself becomes the truth maker of all the truths, ladies and gentlemen. So, since we are dealing with the individuals, these are the elements on the planet Earth trying to explain the reality. And these individuals are also part of the reality. So your thoughts, your ideas, right, being mapped onto the reality, at the end of the day, you can actually try to map the reality onto the individuals who are attempting to think, who have thoughts and ideas. So the moment you begin by saying that, yes, you can map, right, the truth maker to many truths, at the end of the day, you can also map the truth to the truth maker, and that's why we're saying that at the end, right, the world itself becomes the truth maker of all truth, right? But the main difficulty with the Armstrong's theory of truth makers and other theories of this kind is not so much the profligate metaphysics of states of affairs, right, or universals and their individuation conditions that it presupposes, right? So again, issues of metaphysics are very important, but the central question here is that such theories, like the ones we have already gone through, can hardly tell us why truth makers make propositions true. Because you have the truth makers, you have an individual who has thoughts, you have ideas, and you are saying that, yes, you have the propositions, and they must be true because they must be mapped onto the facts. But you still have a question, right? These theories do not tell us, right, why truth makers make propositions true, hence explaining the correspondence relations without presupposing the notion of a true proposition itself. So again, to see this, consider what Armstrong calls the truth maker principle. The truth maker for a truth must necessitate that particular truth that is being put forward. And in this case, if you want to get very nice ideas and the kind of thinking that these fellows had when they were advancing this knowledge. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to invite you during your free time, because I don't think I can really cover everything that is said. And I want to move towards the end and attempt to close. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, there are so many things that we need to do and we need to go through. Unfortunately, the time has never been on our side, and we have already used about 1 hour and a few minutes. And I think it would only be fair for us to be able to move on and certainly close. So why don't I then present to you the works of Austin, right? But probably before the Austin, there's another very important, which is actually the metaphysics or metaphysical truth that we need to understand in this perspective. Right, so I'll take you through the metaphysical truth, and then also give you an equation that presents that. And thereafter, I'll close, ladies and gentlemen. So we had just stopped on Armstrong's perspective that the truth maker for the truth must necessitate that particular truth that is being propounded. So in this case, in the useful, theoretically guided conceptions that we have here, we can also have sort of misconceptions and misleadings about the world out there, especially if a certain truth maker makes a certain truth true. Right, if you look at the truth maker, because remember I told you that the theory does not tell us how the truth maker makes the propositions true. So if you hold earlier perspectives and thinking about this theory of correspondence that we are discussing as given by the various people who have attended to discuss and critique the theory, right, we can get misleading ideas. More so, if a certain truth maker makes a certain truth true, and we need to interrogate that, and that means there is no alternative world where that truth maker exists, but the truth is a false proposition, ladies and gentlemen. So it is not clear that this does not amount to more than the truism that if a proposition is true, then necessarily there is something in virtue of which it is true. So in the sense, and this is presented in the sense of necessity of analytic truth, right? And of course we can always rephrase this, and it will bring forward what we call the correspondence theory, which doesn't tell us much about the meaning of in virtue of relation, and so that has not been really substantiated in this particular sense. Now, if we formulate, ladies and gentlemen, as I'm closing, if we formulate the principle as saying that every truth is necessitated by something, right? So every truth, so we now introduce the element of necessity, right? Every truth is necessitated by something, right? And if we read the necessity, the element of necessity, as metaphysical necessity, because we are talking about issues of A being mapped onto B, we are dealing with the issue of being, right? Now, but here we are not discussing being in the sense of a human being, no. Being. So what do we say when we say that this exists? And in what form does it exist? Being, first of all, an object, right? So you can talk about the being of this, right? And you can talk about the being of other things, right? You can talk about the being, right? So we're talking about the being. So we have introduced the concept of a necessity, and we are reformulating. So if we reformulate the principle, right, and we say that every truth is necessitated by something, Now, if we read now, we change that word necessity, right? And we read it as metaphysical necessity. Then we can say TM, which is the metaphysical necessity, the TM necessarily, right? If we are now coming up with a thought, TM, right, will always be there if the proposition that P is true, right? And of course we can go ahead and say, then there is something such that it necessarily entails the truth of P. So that's why I have necessary, right? I've told you, such that it necessarily entails the truth of P. So TM, which is our truth now, right? And remember, we're talking about metaphysical necessity of the truth. TM necessarily, right? If the proposition that P is true, then there is something such that it necessarily entails the truth of P. Now, it implies that a false proposition P necessarily has no truth maker, and that there is something, and that there is necessarily an infinity, there's necessarily an infinity of possible truth makers for P. So you don't have, as we said, that you can have so many items being mapped onto one, but you can also have one item being bumped on so many other things there. And that's what we are saying. It implies both a false proposition P necessarily has no truth maker, and that there is something, an infinity of possible truth makers for P in this case. And if we advance the argument, as I'm closing, ladies and gentlemen, for instance, if one says that a particle lacks spatial location at time t, the sentence, this particle is somewhere at t1 or t dash dash, is false, because it is not, as you can see, the t is false, is no truth maker. But there is an infinity of possible places that the particle could have occupied, hence an infinity of possible truth makers for the proposition. So if you say the particle lacks spatial location at time t, right, that's the implication, that this particle, right, which you can call y or s, whatever it is somewhere at t, right, dash dash, would be false, because at this level you're not talking about truth maker. But there is an infinity possible places that the particle could have occupied. So this recalls the difficulty that Russell had with negative facts. And one can avoid this consequence if TM is read as saying, and you can see on the screen here, we have given this to you to reflect on. TM star necessarily, if P, then there is a proposition X such that this proposition is true, and necessarily the truth of X implies that particular proposition, ladies and gentlemen. But this amounts to saying that necessarily a proposition that P is true if and only if P and the notion of truth making disappears at the end of the day. As we shall see in subsequent lectures, this truism does not license any substantive notion of fact or state of affairs. And not all truth maker theories accept the principle TM that I've just given you, right? TM. Of course, you have the truth maker here in this perspective. And of course, although we're talking about the metaphysical necessity, right, but you could still replace TM with the truth maker, right? So if you read that metaphysical necessity, so that's the truth maker necessarily, has to be there, ladies and gentlemen. So P is true, then there is something such that it necessarily entails the truth of P, and that's what it is. So that's what it is, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you very much for attending this lecture. I've not been able to go through the works of Austin, 1950, but I pray that you'll be able to read these things on your own and try to understand what these concepts are all about. But just to remind you some of the issues that we have been dealing with, that was our lecture 19, and lecture 19 has dealt with the correspondence theory of truth, and that's where we shall pick from next time when we meet. I want to thank you very much and wish you a nice time. Stay well, stay safe. Bye. Have a nice day.